interesting. In the United States, I think the last time I checked, the average school start time is somewhere around 7:30, 7:45.
Sounds about right.
And if you think about that for 7:30 school start times, school buses will begin leaving around 5:30, 5:45 in the morning. That means that some kids are having to wake up at 5 a.m., maybe even earlier. This is lunacy when you think about it. And there's a great study in Edna, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, Edna, which is a small suburb, or it sits in a small suburb outside of Minneapolis in Minnesota. And they shifted their school start times from 7:25 to 8:30 in the morning. And then they wanted to ask, what is the consequence of that on the academic performance of their students? And the metric that they used in these teenagers that they were focusing on was something called the SAT score, which is a score I had to learn when I first came to the United States, is a critical assessment test that will largely determine which university you go to. And they did an analysis which was clever. They focused on the top 10% performing students, which you could argue those are the ones that are closest to the ceiling performance and the hardest to expect any benefit from sleep. So in the year before they made the time change, the average score of those top 10% performing students was 1,288, which turns out to be a pretty good SAT score. The following year, after they made the time change, the average score for that top 10% was 1,500. That difference is non-trivial, and it will change exactly where those individuals will go to university in terms of the tier of the university, and likely change the trajectory of their lives as a consequence. Now, some people have argued that data, in terms of its source and its reliability, may not have necessarily been accurate, but now we've got very consistent data. When you start school times later, academic grades improve, psychological and psychiatric problems decrease, truancy rates decrease. But something else happened in that story of later school start times that we didn't expect, which was that the life expectancy of students increased. And you think, well, hang on a second, how do you determine that? The number one cause of death in teenagers 16 to 18 is actually not suicide. It turns out to be second. It's road traffic accidents. And here, sleep matters enormously. There was another great example from Teton County in Wyoming, and they shifted their school start times from, I think it was 7:35 in the morning to 8:55. And the only thing more remarkable than the extra 1 hour of sleep that those kids reported getting was the drop in car accidents. That following year, there was a 70% reduction in car crashes in that age range of 16 to 18.
What time are they getting out of school?
Well, they will probably be ejected out of school. That's another interesting part, by the way. Maybe around 4:30. And people have said, well, look, all of this idea of later school start times, it means that it's going to cost us more because you've got to change the school bus system. And they've argued pushback against that. And I would say probably two things. First, I know it's difficult, and I'm not saying it's an easy problem to do. It's a complex problem. And I'm sympathetic to that. But I think we've put people on the moon. And so I suspect that we can also solve the problem of early school start times. The other component of that is, what are we doing as educators? If our goal as educators is truly to educate and not risk lives in the process, then we are failing our children in a most spectacular manner with this incessant model of early school start times. And if you look at the data, it's very clear. When sleep is abundant, minds flourish. And when it's not, they don't. And so that's the reason why myself and a whole group of sleep scientists, we started to try to create a movement for later school start times. And we got this bill passed, firstly in California, and we got it on the governor's desk at the time. It was Governor Brown. And unfortunately, he didn't sign it into law. Then when the organization changed and Governor Newsom came in as governor of California, we got the bill back on his desk, and he did sign it. And then the next state to go was New York. They started to put in legislation for recommendations for later school start times. I think Florida is about to fall as well in that regard. So there's gradual movement happening, but it's hard fought and it's problematic. I still think that it's impossible to deny that data. I mean, it was an interesting thing. I remember when I was a professor back at Harvard, we were doing this work on sleep and learning. And they said, and it was sort of published in these sort of kindly, I don't know how we did it, but in nice journals. And they said, okay, based on the media attraction, would you write an editorial for the Harvard newspaper, which was called the Harvard Crimson? And I said, I'd love to. So at first I thought I'm just going to write a straight piece about sleep and memory and why it's important. And I realized, no, there's a better opportunity because teaching there, and you know this as well as I do, there is this bizarre system where we teach for an entire semester and then we end load the semester full of exams in this stressful 2-week period. And what do you think is going to happen? They're not going to sleep, especially at a time when they're trying to cram information. So,
right, especially in college where you don't actually have the material 4 weeks before. So there's not really the option to learn it in advance. Everything's about university to me. It was about getting a bunch of information and needing to incorporate it very quickly and then move to the next item.
Right. Next item. And then all of a sudden, there's this cataclysmic moment at the end of the semester, and you are supposed to regurgitate this by cramming everything into your brain in this sleepless 2-week period. So rather than saying, look, the students need to change their behavior, they need to understand this is a problem, it's not their fault. I said, it's us as educators and administrators. We have created a system that forces them to undergo deliberate sleep deprivation, and we are educating them amnesic, quite literally. So I put this editorial out. It received a rather Baltic, if not Arctic, response. And that was the last editorial I was ever invited to write for the newspaper. But, you know, you've got to say your piece.
Well, but I'm curious why there's resistance to shifting to later school times and to improving the conditions for learning if the goal is to learn. I mean, tradition dies hard. That's why. I think there's also the idea, certainly in the medical profession, that, you know, well, when I was doing my training, we would pull all-nighters all the time. And so the idea then is that it's just part of the self-directed hazing process that is getting a degree, that you're going to be doing a lot of all-nighters and cramming and things of that sort. Is that what you think motivates the resistance to change?
I think so. I think you've hit all the points. I think, you know, zeitgeists die one generation at a time. And we see that resistance certainly there too. I also think that when you come back to later school start times, they have suggested that there is this cost when they tally it up. But you made a point, which is, when do they get out of school? And let's say it's around 4:30. One of the interesting analyses that was published, and we latched onto this, that is this strange, bewitching hour when kids get out of school, but often their parents are not home to work. And if you look at the teenage crime rate, and you look at when those crimes are committed, it's usually in that bewitching hour after they get out of school, but they don't have a home or parents yet to go to that it's filled. But by pushing school start times later, they get out later, they go home. And if you were to even halve that debt that those crimes cause, you would easily pay for the education system.